evening. Alright, guys. Gonna pick up where we left off last time, continuing in the series on my great-great-great-grandfather's memoir of the American Civil War. Smoking a Blakemar Sir Douglas with some... Well, you can't read it. Bob's Chocolate Flake. In the summer of 1863, while we were camped at Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the teams with guards went out on the Greenville Springs Road to get wood for cooking purposes for the different companies of the regiment. One of the companies, Sea Guards, by the name of John Thelian, got out a little too far from the other guards picking blackberries, called dewberries down there. They were black just the same, and he was taken prisoner by the rebels who were laying in watch for stragglers. When the other guards returned and found that John Thelian was missing, Captain Brooks got permission from the colonel to find out what became of Thelian. After we got out about 10 miles, we found out from a Negro boy that the rebels had one of our soldiers as a prisoner, and the Negro boy told us that there was a right smart lot of rebels just across the river about several miles from there. So we galloped on until we came to the river with a high bank, where the road had to be cut wide enough for teams to pass through. The advance guard went down through this pass and found several of the rebels washing clothes. Our guards at once fired at the rebels, and that started the battling going. As they had several hundred men there, you could hear the rebels calling, "Fall in Company B" and "Fall in Company D," and so on until all their men were in line. Captain Brooks didn't want to be outdone, so he hollered, "Fetch up the artillery," and then he called for different companies to come up, and our company had orders to march down this alleyway and shoot what was loaded and fall back. We kept them going for a half an hour, and the man that went down with me, by the name of John Craig, and his horse was shot, and we could see the man that shot the horse as he was behind a large cypress tree, but we had to face back as they were coming, too many, and they were too thick. It happened we were up on a hill, and they were in the valley below, and the way those balls went over our heads, we were like a hive of bees. John Craig's horse dropped dead as he got on the hill, and John got on behind me on my horse, and that was the end of that little fight. We had to go back without Thelian, but Thelian was just where the rebels were and heard the whole fight. His story was that there were several hundred rebels. We only had about 25 men, and we held them off for almost an hour, and Thelian was under guard at that time. But that night, while the rebel guard was marching up and down, Thelian got away from them, and by the next night he reported to the company, being out in the woods one night. The southern people must have suffered a great loss. All our horses were taken from those people, 1,000 or more horses. And when riding through their country, we had foraging parties out to take whatever was needed for horses and men, and they didn't always stop at that. In 1864, the colored people were used to having religious meetings, so I attended one of their meetings with a comrade named Lathern, and they had a large room with a balcony on each end. And there was an old colored preacher with glasses on. He would repeat a few words, and then the audience would repeat after him. They would become very excited and have what they called the powers, and would jump up and down. One or two got so excited that they jumped out a window. We stayed until the meeting was ready to close, and Charlie Lathern said to me, "Do you see that octoroon girl? Isn't she handsome? And I am going to take her home tonight." So he kept his eye on her and followed her out. I was close behind, and he reached over and said, "Can I take you home?" He reached a little too far, and there was an old colored woman who heard him. She said, "Go away, boy. I'm old enough to be your grandma." Charlie never heard the last of that. The 4th Wisconsin Cavalry was made up of all classes of men. We had with us some of the noted men as Colonel Halbert E. Payne, Washington, D.C., H.D. Horde, one-time governor of Wisconsin, Newt Nelson, late U.S. Senator from Minnesota, G.W. Peck, once governor of Wisconsin, author of Peck's Bad Boy book, whatever that is, and General H. Hobart, General H.C. Bailey of the Red River fame. We had doctors, lawyers, ministers, mechanics, blacksmiths, tailors, watchmakers, engineers on trains, shoemakers, 2 horse doctors, or in fact, you get a man for most work from one of the companies. The 4th Wisconsin had its first reunion at Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1889. George Peck had a beautiful home on some avenue there, had a large double lot on one side of the avenue where the whole regiment that was left camped. George Peck had his tents pitched for them, and on the opposite side were headquarters for all the 4th Wisconsin boys. While they were in Milwaukee, he had a barrel of ice water, and all the boys registered. They all got together and raised a good sum of money and presented Comrade Peck with a fine gold watch. He was so pleased and affected that he was brought to tears. This brought tears to his eyes. Comrade George Peck was called upon to make a speech, for which he was always ready for the occasion in a witty way, and the boys were all sitting around in the grass, and he got up in his usual way with his wife at his back, and he began in this way: "Do you know, boys, the worst thing the government ever did was to get up a war the first year that I got married." His wife smiled, and you can imagine the cheers that went up for Comrade George Peck. Do one more. In the later part of 1863, we went out on a scout to a place called Clinton, Louisiana, and we captured a rebel male. We had a great sport in reading their letters. We picked out a good reader from the company, and he got on a stump and read the letters, the boys sitting around with handfuls of letters looking them over, and some would holler, "I got one," and would pass it in to the reader so that they could all hear what was funny in the letter. And the letter would read about as follows: "This letter is from a newly married man telling his wife how many Yankees he had killed. Already he thought the war would soon be over and that he would soon have the Northerners whipped. And then he would go on and tell the nice time he had before the war, and to keep her eyes on the colored slaves so that they would not run away." And another letter would be written to their mothers as follows: "Dear mother." The others were written to their sweethearts, and some were very mushy, and then all the boys would have a good laugh. There were quite a number of persimmon trees around where we were. They are the most delicious fruit after the frost had struck them. I think they were the sweetest fruit I ever tasted, besides the mulberries, which grow on trees as large as our apple trees. I was in one of the persimmon trees. The other boys were lying around waiting for orders, when all at once we were fired upon, and we had quite a battle right there. The rebels were armed with old Kentucky rifles, which loaded from the muzzle, and the soldiers wore their old-fashioned powder horns. They had in the butt of their guns a little trap door where they had patches that wrapped around the ball, which was rammed down after the powder was in the barrel. We had about an hour's engagement, as we had several shooters where they only had a single shooter. They soon had to retreat, and we went back to camp. In 1863, I was on a scout with 25 men with Lieutenant Meadow and company. We went to a place called Old Branch, Louisiana. We had been there, was quite a number of rebels foraging around there, about 30 miles out from Baton Rouge. We came across to a crossroad, so we took the crossroad. That was about 12 o'clock at night, and dark as pitch. I was on the advance. After about 10 miles on the crossroad, we came on their advanced pickets. We charged them, our reserves came up, and then the fireworks started. As the reserves were alongside of the road, they started to fire, and then we opened fire. All we could see was the flash from their guns. It was a fine sight. It was then about 5 o'clock in the morning. They had started to cook breakfast. We charged on their camp and took 2 prisoners. Their object was sweet potatoes, or yams, as they called them. I think there were about 100 bushels in that pile that they were going to load up with, as they had teams waiting. We cooked our coffee and breakfast on their fire. There was nothing more doing, as we did not care for sweet potatoes. Just took a few and the prisoners. We lost no men and could not tell what happened to the rebels, as we could see only the flashes from the guns, but there were 50 or more shots fired, so we took the road back to the main road, when we reached the main road, it started to rain. Long towards evening, it turned to cold sleet, rain, and started to freeze, and the horses' tails and manes were a mass of ice. I tell you, I never was so cold before. We were so close to a party of rebels, we could hear them. I was so cold that I could not raise the hammer of my gun, but I had the satisfaction of knowing that they were in the same fix. The next morning, we had a hot mush, as we got a bag of cornmeal and found an old kettle that would hold the whole bag full. And so we got busy and made a good fire and got the kettle filled partly with water. Then we stirred it until cooked, and we had hot mush for breakfast with hardtack and black coffee. No milk or sugar. Most of the time on our marches, we were troubled with poor water. Oftentimes we had to skim black or green scum in order to get water to make our coffee, and sometimes a dead horse would be lying close by those cypress swamps, which were in some places temporary log roads. These were made so our horses and artillery could pass over. Sometimes those places were overflowed with water, and you could see the high water mark on the trees in the swamps, and the water would rise some 12 or 15 feet in the wet seasons of the year. We used to have trouble to make our fires to cook with. It was nothing but green and wet cypress, and hard to get that wood to burn. The cook would fry bacon or pork and pour the grease on the wood to get it to burn. We had 2 men poisoned by the rebels in 1864 while at Morganzi Bend. Through that country, alongside the Mississippi River, there were lots of mosquitoes. The government furnished mosquito netting, which was made in a little frame just large enough to cover one soldier and protect him from mosquitoes. When out with a flag of truce, we had quite a talk and told stories with some of the rebel soldiers. Up north, they would call it swapping lies. There were pigs of all kinds running wild and living on pecan nuts. One rebel said their pigs were so smart they could climb a tree, and one of our boys told him that was nothing. We had pigs up in Wisconsin called the Razorbacks that could put their heads through a rail fence and eat the fourth hill of corn. Then it went back to mosquitoes, that we had to draw mosquito tents to keep the mosquitoes from eating us up, as they had bills a foot long, and the rebels said, "That's nothing. There are mosquitoes down in this country big enough to straddle the Mississippi River and pick up passengers off the boats as the boat passed under them." That story knocked us all out of our subjects, so we had to go on to something else. While going through some of the states, we had to cross a great many rivers. As our horses were all good swimmers, they would carry us across safely. On some of the rivers, the current was quite swift. Then other rivers had pontoon bridges, which were laid by our engineers, who were always ahead. At times, when crossing a pontoon bridge, the cavalrymen would dismount and lead their horses across. At some of those bridges would swerve back and forth, and we had to be careful in crossing to let our horses not fall over. We had a good many German people in our regiment. We had Company L and Company M, which joined us in 1864. These were mostly all Germans. The sergeant major told me that he was pretty near sure when he went into one of those companies, he would commence with Sherman, Stitzing, Schmidt, Schneider, and all those old good German names. The Germans made good soldiers and could be depended upon. The colored people, the slaves, needed a good deal of praise, as they were our true friends when we were going through that country. I think the colored people had made wonderful strides since the war. If everyone could have seen the condition of the slaves before the war and see the wonderful advancement they made since, it will be seen that the colored people deserve lots of credit. The slave owners treated their slaves as some men treated their horses. It was just a money consideration to get all the work out of them possible, as some of the slaves were very valuable, and for that reason it was important to give them good care. But there were some awful mean slave drivers as well as horse drivers. I have seen some of those colored men stripped, and their backs resembled washboards. And they were human beings. One time we went into colored quarters to see what Auntie had to eat. We found a possum pretty well cooked, and this good old colored woman gave us the possum already cooked and a piece of hoe cake. We went outside to cook our coffee and some sweet potatoes, and while we were cutting the potatoes, the little old woman came out to the fire and saw her skillet and looked up to Gus Norton's face, he being a tall man, and then she would look down at her skillet and say, "Who fetched that?" and looking up at Norton again, she said, "Did you fetch that?" So Gust had to take the skillet back again. Some of the regiments had mascots. The 8th Wisconsin had an eagle. Ours had a dog. And I think it was the 36th Wisconsin that had a parrot. One time, while I was visiting this regiment, about 10 o'clock in the day, I heard very plainly the words, "Fall in for roll call," and I asked one of the boys what time they had roll call, as it was generally the first thing in the morning, and the boys laughed and said, that was the old parrot. While on special duty and on guard, some of our boys had peeled off the bark of a large magnolia tree, and some of those boys wrote their names and addresses on the tree. Later, we had the occasion to fall back, and we passed that tree a few days afterwards. We saw very plainly written under our boys' names these words: "Fools' names and faces are often seen in public places." And that was the last of the writings. A few years ago, while in Hot Springs, Arkansas, I met an ex-rebel soldier who also had his button, which was similar to our little bronze button. We soon fell into conversation to find out which department we belonged to, and as it happened, he was with General Forrest. Our regiment was mixed up several times with the general and his men. We got quite chummy. He told me he had 2 sons who were across in the World War, and I said to him I had 1. We shook hands, and I said, "Let's forget." He said, "Yes, I can forget everything but this ball that went into me," showing me where he was hurt. He said that pained him at times, yet so it was hard to forget. Then we shook hands and bid each other goodbye. And that's the end of that chapter. It's been a long 2 chapters. Thanks for sticking with me, guys. We're getting there. Only a few more chapters to go. I'm excited to get to the part where he goes into Texas. So, take care, God bless, and we'll finish up soon enough. Thanks, guys.